Gordon was the most popular politician in Britain for about a decade.
It was clear that the country wanted change.
We thought that Gordon Brown was way more beatable than Tony Blair.
It's because you and David Cameron were infatuated.
I think we had assumed that Gordon Brown would be tribally Labour, and suddenly he's all over kind of classic Tory territory.
I think he became very, very risk averse.
He'd sort of defined himself by not being Tony, and then when he suddenly didn't have to define himself that way...
That was what he worried about more than anything else.
Welcome to another very special series of Inside the Room with Ed Balls and me, George Osborne.
We are so excited to be back doing Inside the Room again. It's our series that welcomes some of British politics' biggest characters, take us behind the scenes of the moments that have shaped history.
Now, of course, normally on these shows we talk about a big political event that happened, but over the next 3 episodes in this series we're going to be talking about something that didn't happen. Something that didn't happen and as a result had a big impact on both of our political careers.
Yes, and it's going to be a bit triggering because we're going back to 2007, to the election that never happened. In the first few months of Gordon Brown's premiership, to help us along the way, we're going to hear from not one, not two, but 3 key players.
Usually we just interview one person for this show, but actually we're going to interview 3 key people. And we're going to start with Deborah Mattinson, who's one of Gordon Brown's key pollsters at the time. She's going to be in the studio with us very shortly. And of course, she was in many of the rooms that you were in as those key decisions were being taken on the election.
That is right. Then you've also dialed up Andy Coulson, who was the head of communications in the Tory War Room at the time, to mine his memories of the period.
Yeah, and then later in the series, we're going to welcome the godfather of TV political journalism, the great Andrew Marr, who was right at the very centre of the storm and had the key interview.
Here's what to expect.
You both know this was your sliding doors moment. You could have been in the opposite jobs had this gone just slightly differently.
I remember David and I thinking, thank God Tony Blair is gone.
I think what people often forget, Gordon was the most trusted politician in Britain. People really liked him.
What Gordon thought was, I can be the change.
He'd had a very, very good first few months.
We were flying high.
He's all over kind of classic Tory territory.
It was a very symbolic act to bring Mrs. Thatcher in. He was in an incredibly powerful position.
And suddenly the speculation starts. Why doesn't he have an election?
The data said that we would win,
Labour's got it in the bag.
but it also suggested that we might lose some southern seats.
I think he became very, very risk averse.
Is there now about to be a general election or not?
Nobody quite knew what Gordon wanted to do.
I had left the Labour conference pretty much clear that there was going to be an election.
I said, we are going for this now, RB. And he said, yes, he said, we're going for the election.
Gordon was very, very, very grumpy.
You rang me about 2:30 or 3 and said, Ed,
Yes.
you've got to call Gordon. They're changing their minds. He's not calling the election. And I said, what?
It was just complete carnage.
It was a total screw up.
This has got a very happy ending from my point of view. I'm delighted to welcome to the show, to this studio, Deborah Mattinson. Deborah, welcome.
Thank you.
Fabulous to have you here. Deborah and I kind of go so far back. I think by the time we got to 2007, you'd been working directly with Gordon Brown in government for 10 years. How many budgets you'd worked on?
I'd worked on 10. I mean, the budget that we did just before he became Prime Minister was the 10th budget that I'd worked on with him.
But even before that,
Yes.
you know, I was asking Deborah whether she was involved in the 92 election. She said, of course I was, with Philip Gould. They had their own company doing the polling for Neil Kinnock and Labour then. But then...
87 was my first election.
1987. You must have been...
I was 10. I was 10 years old.
I was about to say.
You
Yes.
must have been
I
doing
was,
your GCSEs.
I was a child, yes.
Look, we're going to kick off what I think is going to be, I think especially for Deborah and I, a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, I have
We
to
may
say,
cry.
in the last couple of days, reading back through all of the history, I mean, you know, to use modern language is all quite triggering.
Well, I just want to say, I love the way this ends, this whole thing. This has got a very happy ending from my point of view.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you, George. So we're going
Slightly
to
less so for us.
we're going to kick off our trip down memory lane by setting the scene. The announcement from Tony Blair. About 9-10 months before September 2006, that he was going to be standing down as the Prime Minister. The rise of Gordon Brown from number 11, where he'd been Chancellor, through a sort of Labour leadership election to his arrival in the first week of July in Downing Street in number 10 as Prime Minister.
The truth is you can't go on forever. And of course, it's hard to let go. But it's also right to let go for the country and for you, the party.
On behalf of everyone on these benches, can I congratulate him on his remarkable achievement of being Prime Minister for 10 years?
Since I received the following communication that came across by urgent letter yesterday, this form is important to you. Take good care of it. P45.
A changing of the guard in Great Britain this Sunday. Outgoing Prime Minister Tony Blair handed over leadership of his Labour Party today.
Prime Minister Tony Blair welcomed his successor, Gordon Brown, with a clap on the back.
Can I start by saying thank you? It is with humility that I accept the privilege and the great responsibility of leading our party and changing our country.
There hasn't been a contest, there hasn't been a vote. But in less than a week, Gordon Brown will be Prime Minister.
I would have welcomed a contest if people had stood against me. It just so happened I got the nominations of the vast majority of our party.
In a few moments, Gordon Brown will be invited by the Queen to form a government, and at that moment, he becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
This will be a new government with new priorities. And I've been privileged to have been granted the great opportunity to serve my country.
Gosh, brings the memories flooding back for me. I was there.
Do you realise it's 18 years ago?
I know.
Oh my,
It says something about how old we are. But I was there in the House of Commons when Tony Blair had his last PMQs, and I remember David Cameron kind of urging the Tory MPs to get to their feet and applaud Tony Blair, which I think they rather reluctantly did. But I thought it was sort of so fascinating. It was such an ending of an era. It was the ending of the Blair era, but it had always been the Blair-Brown partnership, hadn't it? But Brown had been such a kind of key figure in the Blair premiership. And now suddenly it was the much expected, long predicted moment when finally Gordon becomes the Prime Minister. So I guess I'm going to ask you both. I'll start with you, Deborah. What was the sort of state of the Labour Party at that moment, and how, easy was the transition? Gordon there is referring to the fact that there hadn't been a contest, but this is the moment he'd been planning and some would say plotting for many years. But what was the sort of feeling in the Brown camp, and I guess more broadly in the Labour movement?
I think the feeling in the Brown camp was exhilaration, actually, at that point. I mean, this was something that a lot of us had been working on for some time, and it had finally happened. And the mood in the country, I think, was quite optimistic too. I think what people often forget, because of what happened afterwards, was that Gordon was the most popular politician in Britain for about a decade. People really liked him. People really respected him. And he had almost single-handedly turned around Labour's long-standing reputation for screwing up the economy to the point where in 2005 we won the election only because Labour was trusted, more trusted than the Tories, to run the economy.
Because that was the Iraq War election, but then
it was the Iraq War election, which honestly, we went into it looking like we might lose. And in the end, it became an economic election.
And Gordon had come to Tony Blair's rescue, hadn't he, during that campaign?
Totally.
But why? Because I'm just going to, before I turn to you, Ed, who was obviously another absolutely key figure in the Brown camp. Amongst the kind of Conservatives, there would have been a feeling that Gordon Brown was an easier opponent, that Tony Blair had a kind of unique connection to Middle England, that, the passing of the Blair era was a big moment. But
it's because you and David Cameron were infatuated. I mean, I don't think you were looking at the polls. If you go back to 2004, there was a possibility of a transition then. Deborah, you were involved 2004, 5, 6, 7 in all of the qualitative polling. What was the country perception of Blair and Brown in that period?
As I just said, at that time, and for some time before that, actually, Gordon was the most trusted politician in Britain.
That's not quite the same thing as being the national leader.
So I think one thing I would say is that his style of leadership was going to be different from Tony's always. He was a different sort of character, different personality. And what what we tried to do was to take the essence of Gordon's strength and power and then to sort of share that with the nation. They'd initially had quite a sort of single-dimensional view of him as the money man, and they trusted him to do that. And one of the things that I was very involved in working with the team was to sort of try to broaden him out a little bit. We had a project that we called Project 3D, which was to sort of show Gordon in a fuller sense to the public.
He'd been doing that as Chancellor, and he'd started to take on overseas aid as an interest.
Yes,
He'd travelled to Africa and to China to talk about, he was sort of moving beyond number 11 already, wasn't
we had another project that we called Project Volvo, because when we asked people,
Reliable,
the kind
safe.
of exactly what kind of car does he remind you of, he reminded them of a Volvo. It was sturdy, it was safe, it was all of those things. So,
what car would they have said that Tony Blair and David Cameron were?
I think David Cameron, I think if you're a Tory, you're just always something very posh. So I think he might have been some kind
when we
of
were the Robin
car or something.
We were a Robin Reliant
Oh,
when
that's
William
bad.
when William Hague was leader and I was his right hand man, and we were going through our worst period. We used to do that car test, and it was always some absolutely hopeless sort of three-wheeled car. But anyway,
actually, sorry,
we would have dreamt of a Volvo.
The really powerful car image for David Cameron was the car that just had his trainers in it.
The shoes.
When he cycled to work.
They were the office shoes.
But just to finish on this Tony Blair point, because we're talking about the Gordon Brown decision making, but this is kind of important. Tony Blair had won 3 elections, albeit in 2005. With Gordon Brown kind of acutely by his side. But the polling was saying that with Tony Blair as Prime Minister, we were in trouble.
Yeah, and we were in trouble. And by the way, I would say it wasn't just 2005 that, they were a good partnership. They worked well together when it worked, and they both brought something slightly different to the party. But 2005, without question, was Gordon's election. He won that election. He won it despite everything else. And the polls were not good for Tony.
That was the election famously with the ice creams on the heath, wasn't it?
The ice creams, yes.
So Gordon's in this incredibly strong position. He's become the Prime Minister. He's stayed, the heir apparent for a decade, which is incredibly, or more than a decade, arguably, inside the Labour movement. Which is an incredibly hard thing to do, to stay on the horse like that in British politics. Ed, but of course there's this big challenge, isn't there? Because he's been around so long, because he's had 10 budgets, as Deborah says, because he's such a key figure, and, I agree with you that he basically sort of won that 2005 election for Labour. Yeah. How does he be the change? Because he's been so much the intellectual and kind of moral heart of the government for a decade.
That was exactly the dilemma which I think he faced, and Deborah and the team wrangled with, and the arguments were about. It was clear that the country wanted change. And if you look at Gordon's speeches through the leadership election to his arrival in Downing Street, it is change. But the question was, what is this change? Yeah. Is it a change from the government? Is it a change of policy or of style? And all the pressure on Gordon, from Tony in particular, was about continuity. That it was important that you carry on my policy agenda. There was kind of hours and months of work, led actually by Pat McFadden and Ed Milliband, on working on the joint...
Where are they now? Running the country.
They are working on the joint policy agenda to manage this continuity. And Gordon didn't want policy change, actually. He didn't really, in his kind of core, want it, because he feared that it would be, a break with Tony Blair and a break with the Tony Blair supporters in the cabinet. Tony kept saying to him, "You won't be trusted on security and defence unless you carry on. You have to go further." All of that discussion around 90 days to 42 days.
This is detention without trial and so on.
Was all Tony saying to Gordon, "You've got to show you're carrying on my work." Ed Miliband and I kept saying to him that you have to go out and say, more about who you are, what drives you, and talk about how you are going to change the country. But he didn't want to do that. He wanted to talk about defence and security and counter-terror because he didn't want there to be a jarring change. But I think actually when you think about what was going on in Gordon's mind, really, he thought that stability had been the success of the government. The growth had been the success of the government. Improving public services had been the success of the government. He thought that Tony Blair's stuff around excessive talking about the private sector was destabilising and we could not do that so much.
This is his public service reform. Because I think if you talk to Tony Blair now, he would say the kind of late stage of his premiership was when he really gets his teeth into education and health reform.
But that's all ex post book writing. The reality at the time was Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were working incredibly closely together on reforms of education and of welfare and in the health service. Foundation Hospitals was a Treasury proposal to Number 10 rather than the other way around. It's true the rhetoric diverged some, but fundamentally what Gordon thought was, I can be the change. I think Gordon thought to himself, him becoming Prime Minister would be enough. And there could be some style changes by that. But he didn't want a lurching agenda change. So when people said, did Gordon Brown run out of ideas because he didn't have a new agenda? I don't think he wanted a new agenda. And to the extent that some of us said, you can be newer on the policy agenda, that wasn't really where he wanted to go to.
But whatever the reason, it did look as if he'd run out of ideas. But we're kind of fast forwarding a bit because quite a lot of things happened in the meantime. But I think it did look like that.
Do you think it looked like that in that July 2007?
No,
and not at that point.
No, that July. I mean, I remember pulling together a presentation of, how the public saw the new Labour government in the round and coming to Chequers and presenting it to the cabinet. And
this was when Gordon
had just become Prime Minister.
Right.
It was the first, it was cabinet away day, a strategy day, and I went and presented it, and I'd actually toned it back a bit because it was so positive. All of Gordon's ratings were so positive that it almost, I took out some of the quotes from focus groups and stuff because it just looked too. Even then, somebody said it was a bit saccharine.
You didn't want the cabinet all throwing up.
Well, exactly. But I'd pulled it back. It was very, very, very positive.
Just to give you an example of this, because I think it's kind of interesting. I became Education Secretary to Children's Schools and Families.
That was a great moment for you, right? You joined the cabinet.
I've joined the cabinet. I'm setting out a children's plan.
Presumably in the job you had chosen.
That's all quite complicated, but because actually on the Sunday after he became Labour leader, Gordon told me I was going to be Chancellor, and then on the Monday said he changed his mind and I wasn't going to be, which to be honest was quite a relief. And so I became...
I'm going to go, but we could have another discussion another time. You should definitely have made you Chancellor then. Anyway, personally.
Whatever. I then, 4 weeks in, am making a statement as part of our children's plan work on academies. Tony Blair was the academies champion. Yeah. Gordon and we were cautious about academies, but I actually approved more academies than any other Secretary of State when I was Education Secretary. But I'm doing a thing about academies. And I'm saying I'm going to make some changes to how the academy programme works. They were quite small changes. I said you didn't have to give £1 million. You could sponsor an academy if you were a university or an FE college rather than just a business person. Academies had to teach the national curriculum, at least on maths and science. I was under huge pressure from Gordon and Number 10. Ed, why are you doing this? Why are you changing things? Just carry on. Continuity.
Really?
Gordon did not want a fight with Tony and his people, even when he became leader. And the reason was that it was a burden in some ways. There was no leadership contest. The fact he only took on John McDonnell and Michael Meacher. There was no Blair figure.
And neither of them had got enough votes to actually trigger the contest.
Nowhere near. There was no Blair challenger. In all that stuff in the run-up to him becoming leader, John Reid, I'm not going to serve in a Gordon Brown cabinet.
Alan Miliband,
Alan Miliband had gone. And there was this sort of sense that maybe the Blair-Brown partnership was fracturing because the Blair people were going to move away, and Gordon was thinking much more about continuity in policy, trying to bind them in, bringing people, trying to have a balanced cabinet. I think he was really worried about there being a break.
But are you both underestimating the kind of burden on the party leader? And I often feel this, I was never the leader of my party, and I always thought David Cameron had these responsibilities I didn't have as Chancellor. He had to hold the party together, and Gordon's now become the Labour leader. Let's be honest, Tony Blair had been rather reluctant to hand over. We won't go through all that today, but
for over not months or weeks but years.
Right. And so, Gordon's first job is to make sure he doesn't have a civil war inside the Labour Party.
That's right.
With the Blairites.
And he was more focused on that than
And so what you're saying is basically there's a lot of thought, which we're going to come on to, about how he presents himself, the kind of personnel he surrounds himself with, and the style of the Premiership, but there's no change to policy.
Well, look, fundamentally, because I think Gordon saw the government's achievements as his achievements, and therefore he didn't want a lurching change. Doesn't mean there weren't some individual policy things, but actually,
But I think he did want change, didn't he? I mean, the goats thing was meant to drive change, wasn't it?
But that's style.
We should just explain that. Hold on, that's government of all the talents.
Government of all the talents.
He brings in a series of...
Digby Jones.
Your friend Digby Jones.
Yeah.
Alan Sugar.
Alan Sugar. It's a great
Alan
list.
West, who's a military guy.
Yeah.
Aradazi, who I think we can say was definitely
very
a good person.
That was a very good. That was
he
fantastic.
was desperate for Fiona Phillips to come over from GMTV to be the public health minister,
Right.
and they talked about that for months and months.
And by the way, it was Mervyn Davis, which was also there. So
it was good. I mean, I think it was good, but in the end, it didn't really deliver.
So you think I'm wrong, Deborah, that actually on policy, he was wanting to be bolder in terms of change?
I felt that he wanted change. I felt we needed change.
Look, how could he... Sorry, the question to you is, he'd been the all-powerful policy-making Chancellor. So what policy could he not have got through because he was Chancellor Exchequer that now he's Prime Minister, he can deliver?
But, you could look at it another way and say all that time, in a way, he was being sort of pulled back in terms of what he wanted to do by the other guy. And suddenly there he was on his own. And this is, I think this gets to the heart of the problem, actually, which is that he'd sort of defined himself by not being Tony. And then when he suddenly didn't have to define himself that way...
The thing is that, look, he could have scrapped academies. He didn't want to. He was sceptical about my small changes. He could have scrapped tuition fees. He didn't want to, actually, I think rightly, but he wanted some small changes around grants. He could have kind of changed the approach to dealing with the threat of terror. He actually was doubling down and wanting to do more of it. When it came to the crunch, there was far more continuity. But I think because he was worried that it had been 10 years and that he would fracture the Blair-Brown coalition rather than... and I think it was a priority to hold it together.
Now, I do... Look, I will just... We're going to come on to how the Tories handle the...
Deborah's looking at me like she's not fully convinced by this.
I'm not entirely.
We're going to come on to how the Tories react to all this. We're in opposition. I'm the Shadow Chancellor at the time. I mean, I'm going to say right now, we thought that Gordon Brown was way more beatable than Tony Blair. That Tony Blair had a reach into Tory hearts across England. He had an ability to connect to southern English voters in a way we just never thought. That although Gordon was a formidable Chancellor, and I found shadowing him pretty much the most difficult thing I ever did in politics.
Well, hang on a second. Second most difficult.
What was the most difficult? Oh, you. Dealing with you.
God, come on. Come on.
I'd forgotten about that. But that was because you were like a mini Brown. You were, now I've lost my track. No, I remember David and I thinking, thank God Tony Blair is gone, because you would have people say to you, including Tory MPs, but Tory voters, Middle England voters, he's the best Tory leader you never had.
He was a brilliant communicator.
And there was never... Gordon exuded, yes, kind of the prudence of the Scottish bank manager, stability, all the things you're saying, moral purpose and seriousness, but he also exuded tribalism, Scottishness to an English audience.
And Deborah's research, I think, showed that. In those weeks before Gordon becomes Prime Minister, in the South East marginals, there was a worry.
There was a big worry. I think that the problems started to emerge with that last budget. That was the 10th budget I'd worked on. I think it was the least effective one, as I had done with other budgets.
Was it the cut in income tax that later led to the 10p trouble?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it was.
And the abolition of the 10p rate, which that's a whole other episode of our podcast.
The other thing that we had tested as part of the package, and it was the most important part of the package as far as voters were concerned, was doing something about inheritance tax.
That's right.
I absolutely championed it, and it was the standout. We tested 4 or 5 different measures. It was the standout measure. It was the thing that voters said, the kind of voters that we really needed to vote for us, the sort of people you've just been talking about, George, said, this says to me that you get me. And we then didn't do it. And we did the cut in income tax, and people were quite cynical about that. They thought they'll give with one hand, take with the other. All of that. It was not, and obviously, as you know very well, it paved the way for you to make the announcement you made on the first day of your conference.
We are definitely jumping ahead here.
We are.
But we were doing the same research, and
of course.
it saw inheritance tax again and again at the top of people's list of priorities. So let's turn to the weeks after Gordon Brown becomes Prime Minister, because there's a lot he had to deal with. Let's just remind ourselves.
Good evening. In the last half an hour, the Home Office has announced that the national terror threat level has been raised to critical. It's in response to the events of the last 48 hours, which have seen a blazing car smash into Glasgow Airport and 2 attempted car bombings in London.
From work, you were very close by, just a few metres?
Oh, about 20 yards. I've seen a Jeep crashed into the front of the terminal building. It was on flames.
Nothing ever happens here. I just can't believe it. We can't even go home.
Convicting terrorists by using phone taps, banning the extremists that radicalise young people in our country, and vitally securing our borders. Aren't these 3 of the practical steps that are absolutely vital parts of the unity that the Prime Minister needs to build so that we can all ensure the terrorists will never win?
It's a real possibility that the outbreak of foot and mouth was caused accidentally or deliberately by human activity from the Pirbright vaccine laboratory.
There are fears of more flooding tonight in many areas of northern and central England.
David Cameron came to Rwanda's parliament to make his keynote speech of this trip, but not everything went to plan. A power cut had left everyone in the dark. It didn't seem to be David's day.
David Cameron suspends the Tory candidate who accused him of lacking substance.
The former Iron Chancellor had the former Iron Lady round for tea.
Joining the Labour Party, are you?
I would describe Gordon Brown as a principled man who really wants to get something done.
In Iraq, we have duties to discharge and responsibilities to keep.
I don't think there's any reason for depositors to panic.
Thousands of customers have been queuing up outside branches of the troubled mortgage lender Northern Rock to withdraw their money.
Well, if they're not in trouble, why are they having to borrow from the government?
Nobody's given an absolute guarantee that the money is safe in this bank.
The deposits of Northern Rock savers are indeed guaranteed.
Just 3 months after he'd moved into number 10, the polls were even suggesting that he would win a general election.
Labour's general election coordinator has dismissed as nonsense claims that Gordon Brown could call an early election this week. But Douglas Alexander refused to rule out a possible election before the end of the year.
So there's lots going on there. There are the terror attacks in London and in Glasgow. There is flooding across the country. This all actually is putting pressure on David Cameron, who has a disastrous trip to Rwanda in the middle of all of this. Then we have President Bush there, you might have heard. Margaret Thatcher turns up in Downing Street as a guest of Gordon Brown. And finally, we end with Northern Rock, which is, I guess, a herald of the years to come. But I guess, let me start by just asking you how Gordon is handling all these crises, because they literally happen in the first few days of his premiership.
Well, the truth is, he was in his element because,
Yeah.
And actually, Deborah had been working for years on how does Gordon Brown show he's different, this change, and then suddenly, in a sort of slightly ruffled, unkempt, dandruffy suit kind of way, he was just dealing with crisis after crisis,
and
going
the
out.
suit's really important. He literally was wearing one on the beach, wasn't he, when he was with his kids on holiday, and was really happy to abandon the holiday and get straight back into the Cobra meetings.
He abandoned his holiday
Yes.
to Dorset after 9 hours.
Yes.
That's quite like Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher hated holidays as well.
Well, Gordon really, no interest whatsoever.
But didn't this answer the change question?
Well, it obviously did in terms of style. And it was, he was like father of the nation. He was exactly what you felt you wanted when things were going wrong everywhere, which they were. It worked very, very well for him.
It's a reminder, by the way, that prime ministers often thrive in crises. When the crises, they're not of their own making.
Well, it shines a light on what they are, And it worked for him. I mean, he could have fallen apart, but he didn't. He was
because he was
strong. He was resilient. He was all the things you would want somebody in charge to be at that moment.
But he did the reading. He went out with a plan. He was very good at saying, this is what we are going to do. These were the moments which played to his strengths.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I think a later criticism of the Brown premiership would be that he wasn't very good at being flexible in the way you have to be as a prime minister and dealing with all the incoming, and it throws you off course. And, a chancellor basically gets months to prepare for a budget and can then disappear again. But in these first few weeks, he's not encumbered by that. He actually seems able to handle, there's a terror attack, there's flooding, there's foot and mouth. Why is he better at it in these early weeks and months than he later felt to observers that he was later able to be?
Because these weren't political crises. These weren't, the expenses crisis and how you handle the way in which Parliament restores its authority. These aren't a cabinet minister resigning because they're criticising Gordon Brown and how he deals with it. These were external events, a terror attack, a bomb, a foot and mouth outbreak in which the country wanted leadership to deal with that external threat, and that was the thing that he was good at. There wouldn't have been a big debate in the cabinet about the response.
Yeah, nobody's going to say, hey, let's just ignore this. The one thing I do think, though, is that governing is about dealing with those crises as they emerge as well as you possibly can. But it's also about not losing, keeping your eyes on the long-term prize, keeping your strategy in place, keeping your, fixed on your North Star. And I sort of feel that as if, looking back on it, that wasn't happening, actually. And that then became apparent that actually, whilst he was managing those events incredibly well, it later became apparent there wasn't a sort of longer-term plan that was also being...
Partly because that all got thrown out the window because he was dealing with event after event after event.
I think when you're governing, you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to deal with the crisis that's in front of you. You have to be able to deal with that day's problems, but you also have to have a clear sense of where you want to be in a year, in 2 years, and still working on that too, or making sure people are working on it.
Do I detect a difference of opinion of what he should be doing? Because you were saying, Deborah, vis-a-vis the budget that he'd had as the last budget, that he should have looked at inheritance tax. We're going to come on and talk about that. But that's obviously a kind of move into Middle England aspiration in a kind of Thatcherite sense. I'm trying.
And he got that. Why do you think he had Mrs. Thatcher around to number 10?
But exactly. your advice with Ed Milliband is actually feels to me more kind of you can go further on rowing back on academies or more on kind of. I mean, I don't want to kind of characterise it as left or right, but I guess more sort of classically Labour issues of child poverty, of welfare reform for the poorest, and so. Whereas I think Deborah is saying you could have, because he could have doubled down on.
I think you're right.
He could have doubled down on Blair. What would have been called at the time Blairite things.
The thing is, though, I just think you're caricaturing. Gordon Brown, as Chancellor for 10 years, was not the guy who only cared about the poorest. He was the guy who wanted to
working families tax credit.
Get people back to work, but it is true. But his mission was an economic and social change mission about opportunity and work and fairness, of part of which was tackling child poverty. I think he downplayed all of that in the 2007 budget and in the leadership campaign because he wanted not to pick fights on those things. I would have done, not to pull away from academies. I liked academies, but you could make some changes. I'm making small changes. He said, Ed, why you want to pick a fight on academies? I said, I don't. I'm just securing them for the next phase. But I think he became very, very risk averse about politics and division in that period. And as a consequence, it made him look like he was lacking some definition.
We should just check in with the Conservatives at the time, because this is a pretty painful period for me and for David. I mean, we had become the leadership of the Conservative Party in 2005. And things had gone pretty well for David compared to the previous Tory leaders who had struggled, William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith and Michael Howard. And there was a strong feeling that Gordon Brown was much more beatable than Tony Blair. We'd done pretty well in the local elections, got 40% of the vote in local elections. Labour got 26% of the vote most recently. And suddenly, the plan falls apart in the face of Gordon Brown's arrival in number 10. And and the momentum, which we felt was in our sails and, things were going the right. Suddenly, swings dramatically the other way. So in preparation for this show, I phoned Andy Coulson, who had just arrived back then as our Director of Communications. And this was his recollection of those first few months after Gordon Brown moved into Number 10.
I agreed to join just before what turned out to be a set of seriously suboptimal local election results. And honestly, I thought this new job might be over before it started. Gordon was very sure-footed in those early months, I remember. He'd created this idea of a government of all talents, and he was doing a very effective job of finding that sweet spot, of appearing to be above party politics, working only in the national interest whilst making sure that he created maximum problems for the opposition. And he was very, very good at it for a while. That whole not flash, just Gordon stuff. The day he invited Margaret Thatcher into Number 10, I remember, was not a good one. The Telegraph put it all over page 1, I think, and there was genuine concern, however mad it sounds, that the Telegraph was going to become pro-Labour. That was the mood at the time. And meanwhile, we were doing a very good job of removing the pistol and blowing off our own toes, with David flying off to Rwanda with floods at home. But when I think back to how we turned it around, I think first and foremost, we were a tight team. We got on, we liked each other. And that fueled a bit of backs against the wall esprit de corps. And we never lost our sense of humour, which is always undervalued when you're in crisis. So all of that gave us the room, I think, to think clearly, plot that strategy for conference that we would hope would have some impact.
Very interesting that Andy Coulson in particular picks out the Margaret Thatcher visit to Downing Street, invited by Gordon Brown to come back. It was like a big event. I mean, I would say, consistent with my thesis, that Gordon Brown was not looking to pick political fights. In fact, he was sort of wanting to be the unifying father of the nation.
Yes.
So, Deborah, what did you think of Margaret Thatcher coming to Downing Street?
I thought it was a good idea. I thought it signalled that he got those voters that he needed to continue to have a conversation with.
And George, you've always been a bit of a Thatcher fan. I mean, how was the reaction to Margaret Thatcher going into Gordon Brown's Downing Street?
Well, it was, a real exocet, to use a word that Margaret Thatcher would be very familiar with, a real exocet into the Tory camp. Because what Gordon was doing, both through the appointment of the ministers we talked about that Andy mentions there, the government of all the talents, getting Margaret Thatcher into Downing Street, a couple of other things that people won't remember now, but were certainly painful for us at the time. Quentin Davis, a Tory MP, defecting to Labour. There was a Tory donor who was persuaded to go and write a report for the Labour Party. There was a Tory MP, Michael Ancram, who started saying, well, I'm not sure this Cameron project's going very well. So, it was very unsettling because I think we had assumed and been, I think, rather complacent in assuming that Gordon Brown would be tribally Labour, easy to pigeonhole, and suddenly he's all over kind of classic Tory territory. And it hadn't really sort of crossed our mind that Gordon could invite Margaret Thatcher around.
So he was a slightly better politician than you thought?
Well, we're coming on later to what we actually thought of Gordon
Brown.
But
that summer was good.
yeah, that summer was very good. I mean, it's interesting. I mean,
good for us, bad for
while
you.
I've got you both in the room, what does Gordon Brown think of Margaret Thatcher?
I think Tony Blair and Gordon Brown both thought of Margaret Thatcher as somebody who, at a moment of national crisis, led change and did so incredibly bravely and effectively. It doesn't mean that there weren't aspects of that.
Of course. I think massive respect, actually. I mean, she was an incredibly successful politician.
But she was absolutely... But,
exactly.
She'd been loathed by the Labour movement, hadn't she?
I know, but politics is not quite as ideological sometimes as you see it.
No, I don't see it at all ideological. You were making the point of how we were rather admiring of the Blair premiership. I mean, in some ways, I think we saw Blair as, in the same way that Blair and Brown had grown up politically under the sort of Thatcher umbrella, we had grown up politically under the Blair umbrella. He had dominated politics when we became MPs. And I think Brown was doing what all new prime ministers need to do, which is sort of make links to the past. I think the temptation of a prime minister is always to say, I want nothing to do with what's gone before me. I would say Keir Starmer's done that with the Tory 13 years. He makes no connection with Cameron or Sunak or whatever. It makes no, and I think that's a mistake. You reach in and say, I am the continuity. You don't need the other people.
It's about continuity, but it's also about conviction and whether at times of crisis you can lead. And I think Gordon would have seen dealing with the crises of July and August as being a conviction politician leading, like Margaret Thatcher had done at key moments in our history.
I think that's right. And I think yes, it was a very symbolic act to bring Mrs. Thatcher in. And it said something about Gordon. It also, I think, said something about the Tories. Why would a past successful Tory Prime Minister come into Downing Street to... Well, I do think it did. I think at a time when you were going through a difficult patch, it was, I would imagine, singularly unhelpful.
It was absolutely singularly unhelpful. And
it was partly designed to be that.
No, well, I think he was, Gordon had you guys had a very effective plan to kind of pull the plugs out of the Tory machine. An MP defecting, a donor defecting, Thatcher turning up in Downing Street. I just thought it was, I thought it was very, very smart. And, he actually brings a portrait of Margaret Thatcher into 10 Downing Street, which interestingly, Keir Starmer is the one who's consigned to the kind of storeroom. And that is Brown, at his kind of political best. But we should just touch on, there's an event there, isn't there, in the medley at the beginning that, of course, comes to absolutely define not just the next few years, but arguably all politics since, which is the collapse of Northern Rock.
Yes.
And at the time, it's just seen as a kind of, it's a shocking event. There's Robert Peston, we should give him a credit of, he breaks the story, doesn't he, on the 10 o'clock news. We heard him there. He was the BBC's economics editor. And it's certainly a shock. It's like the first bank run in 100 years. But it's treated as a kind of one-off event. We should just note it's actually, of course, the herald of the financial crisis, which consumes the government and the world just 12 months later.
I think slightly more than that, actually. I look back and think of the queues outside Northern Rock as being like the Liz Truss budget and the ERM disaster of Black Wednesday in 1992. One of those moments which ends up deeply cutting through. But at the time, I think it was seen in the political media world as another crisis which Gordon Brown was handling. It actually played to his strengths. There was no hit to Labour's polling in that period. In September, would anybody have been saying in the run-up to Labour Party conference, Northern Rock is a problem for Gordon Brown?
No, not at all. Not at all. It was seen as something that he handled well. It was in his comfort zone, dealing with that sort of crisis. He'd already dealt with lots of other things through the summer.
And you are right. It was the biggest event by far of 2007 Northern Rock, and the events happening around that in the global economy starting in August. But I just don't think we had a perception of that, at least in the broader political world at that time.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The credit crunch is starting. Just before we move on to the kind of speculation that's beginning about the election, it's interesting you both are talking about Gordon handling the Northern Rock crisis. Of course, there was a chance at the Exchequer. Alistair Darling, sadly now no longer with us. There's no attempt, is there, in the Brown premiership to establish a kind of partnership of sort of first among equals? He is the dominant figure in the cabinet. No one thinks that Alistair Darling has anything like the power that the previous Chancellor Gordon Brown had in the Blair premiership. Is that, deliberate, or that's just how it is? He's surrounded by what he might regard, and certainly others might regard, as political pygmies compared to the Brown premiership.
I think that's a bit unfair.
Compared to Brown as Prime Minister.
I think Alistair did a good job and worked well with Gordon. It's very hard if you're coming into that role and it's literally the role that the Prime Minister did.
No, don't get me wrong. I think Alistair has his great moment in about 12 months' time, but he starts off as so junior to Gordon. And I think that's true of other members of the cabinet, isn't it, at the time? There's no one who's... there's David Milliband knocking around as potentially the Blair heir apparent, but it's not a duopoly in any sense, or he's a sort of single figure at the top of this government, which is actually quite unusual in British politics. Quite often, you have Thatcher, Lawson, you have Major with Clark and Heseltine, Cameron arguably with me, and you'd say now of Keir Starmer, he's got some big figures like Rachel Reeves around it. Yeah. The Brown premiership at that point is all about Gordon.
Gordon was not choosing a Chancellor to deliver balance for him. It wasn't like Blair and Brown. It was actually, in that sense, much more like Cameron Osborne. Alistair Darling had been Gordon's chief secretary. When you had election press conferences in 2001 and 2005, Alistair, even if he wasn't in the Treasury, would be invited to come along and be with Gordon. But he wasn't a challenge to Gordon at that time. He was a support figure, somebody who would go out and close down issues and handle problems. If anything, part of the problem on Northern Rock was the Treasury was a bit behind the curve. They were a bit slow responding to the Robert Peston report. I mean, I was on the phone to Gordon at 6 a.m. the next morning, urging Gordon to ring Alistair to get out there because we were at risk of losing the incredibly acute sensitivity of the communication around whether the banks would honour people's deposits in those hours. But that was Gordon telling Alistair what he had to do. To the extent there was a tension with Alistair, that all happened later. To the extent there were tensions in the cabinet or worries about balance, it wasn't about Alistair. I mean, I remember being in conversations with Gordon 2007 to 2008. Gordon had made David Milliband Foreign Secretary. There was a genuine conversation Gordon had about whether he should make David Milliband Deputy Prime Minister. You remember famously he didn't make Harriet Harman Deputy Prime Minister. She was Deputy Leader, but she wasn't Deputy Prime Minister. Should he offer that to David as a way to show that unity, that balance between Blair and Brown? He didn't do that in the end. He thought about it. But
left the job free for Peter Mandelson later on.
In the end, he did. But of course,
Ambassador Mandelson.
In a similar kind of way, bridging that Blair-Brown divide. But with Alistair, it wasn't about that. Alistair was there because Gordon wanted somebody he was close to and who would essentially do what he wanted to be Chancellor.
He could pick who he wanted. Tony couldn't pick who he wanted. Tony didn't choose Gordon.
No, he had to have Gordon.
He had to have Gordon.
Well,
he had no choice. Gordon was in a powerful enough position that he couldn't be got rid of. But Gordon, by the time he became Prime Minister, could pick whoever he wanted, which is why I slightly dispute your point, Ed, about him not wanting to rock boats and so on. I don't think he needed to worry about internal. I think he was in an incredibly powerful position. Okay, I know you think
I know, and I kept saying to him, Gordon, why do you keep worrying? I know, but why did he? Because that was what he worried about more than anything else. He believed that the support in the newspapers, which he and Tony had built, and that Tony had sustained with him, would erode quickly in the autumn of 2007 if there was a break between Blair and Brown, and he thought that was an essential part of his political strategy. The Margaret Thatcher thing is one element, but actually it was at least as much focused on what was going on in the Times and the Sun and the News of the World. And he was worried about a fracture, and that I think was, I agree it was too much in his mind, but it was very much in his mind.
And we should say this is still an age when these newspapers are unbelievably powerful in British politics. In the medley that started off this episode, we just heard speculation there that there may be an election coming, and we're going to turn to that next. But this is just starting, isn't it? Things have gone so well. He's made the transition to Downing Street. He's handled these crises. Cameron and Osborne and Go, we're in a mess, and we're approaching the Labour conference at the end of September, and suddenly the speculation starts. Why doesn't he have an election? And that's right, but it's not been anything. It wasn't discussed before he became Prime Minister.
Well, see, I think this is really interesting. Look, we're going to come back to this in the next episode because in the September, suddenly the conversations begin, and I think Deborah may have a different perspective on this. Douglas Alexander had been appointed as election coordinator in the Brown cabinet, as well as International Development Secretary in that July. I don't really remember ever having a conversation with Gordon about calling an early election in July, August, or even the first week of September.
I didn't have a conversation with Gordon, but I had a conversation with Spencer and with Douglas.
Spencer
Livermore, who was Gordon's Director of Strategy, had called me.
Both Douglas and Spencer are now ministers in the Starmer government, we should say.
Yeah. So I had conversations with both of them over the summer. In particular, I remember having a couple of phone calls. I was actually on a family holiday in Greece, and I remember spending quite a lot of time chatting to both of them about this.
But the truth was that Gordon Brown was not on the inside of that conversation at that time.
That I don't know. I didn't have a conversation with Gordon, but I had a conversation with them.
Well, the fact that neither of you had a conversation with Gordon suggests to me that he wasn't thinking, at least actively, with his team about it. And by the way, I was on a family holiday in Greece thinking about the Tory party conference and what I might announce. So that all sets up as a kind of cliffhanger the approach to these big party conferences, and this speculation that it was just a tiny cloud on that, Greek holiday skyline suddenly becomes the big issue in British politics. Is Gordon going to have the early election? And that's what we're going to turn to in our next episode.